Welcome to the Times of Israel's Friday Focus. Today is Friday, July 4th. I'm your host, Deputy Editor Amanda Borschel-Dan, here with our diplomatic correspondent, Lazar Berman, and a very special guest. We have John Spencer, who is the Chief of Urban Warfare Studies at the Modern War Institute at West Point. So, John, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Amanda. Huge fan of the show. Listen every day.
I am such a huge fan of yours as well. And Lazar, I'll welcome you to the show as well, even though, of course, you are more of the host today than I am.
Thank you, and I hope there's some fandom my way as well, but I'd understand if there's not. That's fine.
I'm a huge fan
Lazar,
of yours too, Laser.
Thank you.
There you
Thank you.
go.
That's mutual.
We're all fans of each other. And actually, because of a podcast that Lazar and I had a couple weeks ago, which we called 10 Truths About the Gaza War 20 Months In, John reached out to Lazar and said he wanted to discuss some of these 10 truths. So I'm actually here just to slightly facilitate the conversation right now. But John, just before you dive in and enlighten Lazar and our listeners a little bit on your version of the 10 truths, I just want to ask you, overall, just a really very huge holistic picture in terms of all the hardships of the urban warfare that is so unique in a way to Gaza. Do you feel that overall the IDF has performed adequately?
Absolutely. I think they've, having a context of all urban warfare, the IDF have done what others couldn't do in a situation that nobody else has faced, if that makes sense. The context of Gaza, no military, and this is what I've argued, I mean, there's no military history to give comparison of a ground that's been prepared for 17 years for war, the human sacrifice and shield strategy, the tunnels, the density, the explosives. I think the IDF have performed very effectively, and I'm sure we'll get into that, given the constraints, to include even the resource constraints. The U.S. military would, of course, have done it differently because the U.S. military is different. We have more capabilities, less international. I mean, there's always condemnation, but less like pressures on what we can and can't do in war.
Right. Okay. So, Lazar, I'm going to hand the mic over to you for at least the first bit of this program. And John and Lazar, I am so excited to hear this conversation. So, Lazar, take it away.
Sure. So thank you, Amanda. Thank you, John. I think it'll be helpful for our listeners who have been paying attention to this war for 600 plus days. And I think a lot of people don't really know what to make of it, right? Because on the one hand, you have report after report of really impressive things going on the ground, tunnel warfare, taking out really all of Hamas's leadership. But, we're 600 days in. None of the war aims have fully been met. There's still soldiers dying. And I think it's kind of unclear, how do we really wrap this thing up? So hopefully through our discussion, we can help our listeners get a sense of what some of the big questions are. I think we have a slightly different take on how successful it's been and where the problems are. And hopefully that'll help our listeners really look at this with a new light and be able to make some of these judgments for themselves. But I think we should start with, Donald Rumsfeld, the U.S. Secretary of Defense, during the Afghanistan-Iraq wars after 9/11, said you go to war with the army you have, not the army you want, or whatever the exact quote was. So I think we should start with, on October 7th, the military that was defeated that day, in the battles around the Gaza Strip. How would you characterize it when you look at the IDF before it went through the transformations that it did, and what was the IDF with which it had to plan its Gaza operation?
So I think that's a great question. And I was on the ground for Operation Guardian of the Walls. Right after that, I was on the ground in Israel, studying actually the 67 Battle of Jerusalem and others. Militaries change, societies change. The IDF was looking to the professionalization of the force, lowering the amount of mandatory service months and trying to professionalize more. The wall had shown effectiveness. The Iron Dome had shown effectiveness. The hierarchy of threats, as you covered in the podcast, of Iran, Hezbollah, Hamas, in Gaza, both and in the West Bank. But very professional military with strong ties to multiple other militaries, and I had been going there for years, studying their approach to urban warfare in, say, Alim and Of course, the tunnel warfare aspect that I specialize in. And I don't think you can categorize one term to say this is what the IDF was. Uh, I'm sure we'll get into about, I've been studying the IDF for years for even me to understand what the reserves, that term means when you're talking about the IDF, and what it means kind of internationally is a lot different. So where you have, mixed units of kind of serving or standing military and then the reserve force coming, I would debate with my friend Jacob Stoyle about, they call the IDF that is in operations now the holding force to hold things until the reserves can come and basically do the operation. Almost like the reserves are more professional than the standing force. And there's this big debate within us about that.
Yeah. So, yeah, thank you for that. And I think what I would point at, what is instructive for some of the choices Israel had to make around the war in Gaza and that are still in fact affecting the war in Gaza and also the campaigns against Hezbollah and Iran, is that there was this 3-decade move away from Israel's classic doctrine, this classic idea that we want short wars. Those short wars are won by ground maneuver, dominant ground maneuver, quick, again, based on the reserve force, but that means you really have to invest in tanks primarily, and that is what wins wars for you. And since it was really the lessons of 73 that moved the IDF away from it. By 82, they were still, the ground force was at its largest, but that's where you start seeing the revolution in military affairs shift Israel's focus to the intelligence and to the Air Force. And then you have basically three decades where Israel does everything it can to avoid significant ground maneuver. And when it's used, it's kind of last resort, as it was in 2006. And therefore, they thought that they could start closing down a lot of the reserve force that you were referring to, since it's not really the key to victory anymore. It's just kind of these out-of-shape guys that you have to spend money on once in a while, and you're never going to use them anyway. And I think that is something that affected the way even the way the planners after October 7th were thinking about the war. They were saying, do we know how good these guys are? They haven't trained much. We don't know how well the tanks are taken care of. And I think there was this inherent comfort with using the strengths of the IDF, which is the intelligence in the air, and to move away from the ground force. So I think that was something that affected the campaign itself.
As the kind of the student of war, I hope we don't interrupt each other, but militaries absolutely hang on to concepts that they believe are the guiding force of their doctrine. Although I would point more to the IDF's raiding military concept, that the ideal that it'll take the initial hit and then raid into enemy territory to achieve its goals. It's not meant to occupy or hold anything. And we'd have to look at what the influence of the 2008 Gaza, 2014, 2019, these operations had on this kind of, we call it doctrine, right? Big D doctrine is kind of the way we do things, and small D doctrine is what we write in our books. All of those factored into what the IDF was on October 7th, to include the reliance on technologies that all militaries do. This technological advance, whether it's the sensors on the wall or in the Air Force, will allow you to have a smaller, more costly force, while other people will say, well, no, I need a bigger standing army. And Israel's society as a whole was really looking at that, like, how can we decrease the size of the standing army?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's take that and let's move into the planning. So there was 3 weeks after October 7th where you had people like Chico Tamir, who was a reservist general, and some other people get together and create what is the invasion plan for the Gaza Strip. And that is basically what was followed for the initial months at the height of the campaign. So how would you, when you look at the initial months, so basically late October, it was like the night of October 26th, 27th, and then it went into November to the first ceasefire hostage release, and basically till mid-January, early February, when there was the release of the majority of the reserve force. How do you, when you look at the way that campaign was constructed, what was prioritized there? How do you react to that? Do you think it was appropriately built and conceived of?
So I actually did interview Chico. So I was surprised. That was one of the things that kind of triggered me in the earlier podcast about the planning started on October 7th. And if you talk to Chico, these plans were on the shelf and he had been a part of developing them both for Gaza and for southern Lebanon for a while. So that one kind of like, but I will say, and I agree with you, that the focus was on, military's focus in war on two things, either enemy-based, terrain-based, and some people would say friendly-based, protecting the friendly. This plan absolutely focused on the Hamas military because, and what wasn't mentioned in your first podcast is that the number one thing taken off the table, both militarily and politically, was the occupation of Gaza, the rule of Gaza, which would, as a kind of a strategist or a historian of other wars or even a student of other wars, by taking that off the table, it did limit the feasibility of any plan to achieve all three goals simultaneously, although each one could be pursued. The initial, I've heard your comment about not attacking the south. So the IDF basically 3 divisions in the north focused on the heart of the Hamas military, so a very military centric rather than terrain based. So they focused on the northern part of Gaza, north of the Wadi Gaza with the 162nd, the 252 and 36 divisions. But I would want to put that in context. Okay, what was available? How much force could the IDF mobilize to do this operation? Again, like if it was the American military, I can do the cost. I can give you the previous battles of how many forces, force ratio, enemy versus friendly that you put against, right? In the urban terrain, usually it's 3 to 1, right? You want 3 soldiers basically to 1 enemy. In the urban terrain, it can be 10 to 15 to 1. So just the combat power ratio of what would be needed to take back defended enemy terrain would be 10 times what the IDF had available. Given that context, I think the operation did achieve strategic surprise, even for Hamas, on not attacking the way that Hamas wanted to, focusing on what they viewed as their center of gravity for the brigades in northern Gaza.
Yeah, so if we're looking at the Gaza City campaign itself, absolutely a lot of tactical brilliance. It went much quicker than anyone would have thought. And the way, the troops were able to kind of link up on the beach and then move from west to east, which is the opposite way than Hamas was set up, absolutely brilliant. But what I'm critical of, and I'm sure you've heard this from me before, is that there was a few things I think that played into it. One, there wasn't confidence in the IDF's ability to maneuver in force. You had division commanders who hadn't commanded divisions. You had 252, which entirely reservist brigade, and you talked to some of the people about the state they found their tanks in and their APCs in, on October 7th and 8th, and it wasn't great. And the fact, I think, that there wasn't a major dilemma across the Gaza Strip for Hamas because it's not, you had Division 98 I was in Division 98. We weren't doing much, until late November. So those forces were available. That's a very, very good division, probably the IDF's premier division. And had the IDF gone into Khan Yunis while the Gaza City operation was going on, I think that would have really, put a lot more stress and confusion into Hamas. And then you can even ask if indeed, as Netanyahu claimed repeatedly in 2024, that the Philadelphia corridor on the Egypt-Gaza border was so key and Rafah was so key, why not do that in the first act and then cut off Hamas from any resupply? And given the legitimacy you have after October 7th, you're going to finish that move before a lot of that legitimacy kind of is squandered, as inevitably civilian casualties rise. So that is my real critique of the way the initial campaign was cast and planned.
So I definitely understand that. And you probably would know better about individual division commanders. Although, I was interviewing like the 55th Brigade by December of 2023, and he had fought in Gaza as a platoon leader, as a battalion commander, and then was running a brigade as a brigade commander, having
in
been
Khan
in
Yunis, right?
No, in Bet Hanoun.
55, okay.
Yeah. And I did interview, General Goldfuss in the 98th Division, which is this broader picture as we we discuss the Gaza operation. It can't be held in and of itself of what was going on in Israel at the same time. of having to fight even at the political level, a battle of should we go north or should we go south? And what forces do we have? And I think that was one of the truths of the first truce was about Hezbollah. From a kind of a military viewpoint as well, is understanding that the north was as vulnerable as southern Israel for attack by an October 7th style attack. I was visiting all of those locations, and had Hezbollah been on the same sheet of music and launched an attack, it would have been awful. So what available forces like the 98th that you had, your commando element that does go into Khan Yunis by January, I think is a kind of that level of decision making of how much resources do I have to commit against all of these threats, to include, you would know better than I, of the real threat that they had to get forces up to the north to protect the north. That would be the element of that. Now on the, going into Rafah, I think the other context there, which I know a little bit about, but the conversations that Israel is having with Egypt because of the sensitivity of the Egypt-Israel agreement. So could Israel have launched and seized the Philadelphia quarter and just said, I don't care what Egypt says. Egypt does launch an armor brigade to seal the Gaza border on their side and put up a 30-foot razor wire by December. This thing is up. So I think I'm missing a little bit of information on what was the conversation at that higher level of what was going on in Rafah with the Rafah brigade and the crossing in those tunnels and everything.
Yeah, no, I definitely do hear that. But the sense I get is if Israel had done it in the first month, let's say, there was so much sympathy for Israel that even Egypt couldn't, they could have expressed their displeasure, but it also on one level would have made
displeasure,
Egypt a little calmer.
War. Like Egypt could say you violated the Treaty Act.
No. I don't think that's a realistic possibility. Maybe, there's some Israelis that did think that, but, the big Egyptian concern initially was that Israel would push a lot of the population into the Sinai. So if you had put, Israeli divisions on that border, I think that also could have alleviated that. But let me ask you a question, maybe that we should take a step back. What do you think about the war aims? Do you think they were appropriately expressed, and do you think that it's realistic? Because we hear a lot of times people saying that, you can't defeat Hamas, it's an idea, you can never defeat an idea. So how would you react to Israel's very clear, I think very consistent expression of its war aims?
Absolutely. I agree with you. Consistent, and they haven't changed. And most people don't understand the history of war. They can actually change. Like, strategy is a process, not a defined plan from day one. But the goals of returning the hostages, destroying Hamas's military capability and its political governance of the Gaza Strip, but also to ensure that no threat comes from the Gaza Strip, which really talks about the reforming of the border area and all of that. I think all three of those goals are definable, as in you can define them and you can measure them, and that any alternative wouldn't be the appropriate goal given the October 7th invasion that I call it is an invasion. It wasn't just a terrorist attack. It was an invasion of southern Israel. That goal of removing a power, and this is where I've seen everybody not you, but most people, the faulty comparisons to counterinsurgency or counterterrorism tactics, as in you have to do it in a way that doesn't further radicalize the population. You have to do certain strategies, and that's not the right, for me, comparison. The goal is to remove a power from an area, although this is not a state. Gaza was a self-governed area with a government and a military. The better analogies are Germany, Japan, or any other situation where you're trying to remove a power, just like we did in Iraq and Afghanistan. While they turned into horrible nation-building projects, the enemy was defeated within 2 weeks. The initial goal, change, was achieved. And those are better analogies. But I've seen everybody fall folly to this fallacy that this is a counterterrorism fight. While they are terrorists, this is about removing a power from an area. And if anybody thought in Israel that was going to be done quickly, then they also haven't been a student of the right wars.
I often say that if we can only do one thing well, what we need to do is to delight the customer. Our goal is that everything we do falls into the background, and customer has the experience of, wow, that was easy. And our challenge, and what has made it most interesting along the way, is to keep finding ways to deliver the personal connection and the personalized service in a virtual world. We consistently get feedback, unsolicited, from customers along the lines of, this is the best company that I've ever worked with. At the end of the day, it's the care that each member of the team takes that makes the entire experience what it is.
So I think we agree that the war aims were appropriately defined and realistic. And I think we would agree that there's tactical excellence, kind of across the board, and especially even among the ground forces, but certainly between the ground forces and the air and the intelligence. I don't think there's any other military that's doing things that the IDF is doing, the tunnel warfare, and a really very quick, learning curve for the reserve forces. For me, there's a missing operational level that translates all of that tactical excellence that Israel is known for and explains how, if I'm going to break apart Hamas units and I'm going to kill a lot of Hamas members and I'm going to blow up their tunnels, how is that going to get Hamas exactly to give in, to bend to my will, right? And I think we've heard it change throughout time. Sometimes Israel says, oh, the humanitarian aid element will pressure Hamas into giving into our demands. Or we have to turn the population against Hamas. Or when the key is the leaders of Hamas. Or it's once we get to, I think we heard Netanyahu say this, once we defeat the 4 brigades left in Rafah in 2024, then we're just one small step away from victory. So would you agree that it's the operational level that is supposed to translate tactical success into achieving your war aims that we might be missing here, or there might be inconsistency from Israel?
We call it the bridge, right? The strategy bridge, the bridge from tactics to strategy. Operational, a lot of people confuse is it a level of war, like a theater level? So maybe the Gaza theater and then the northern, Hezbollah theater. I understand what you're saying. I have this thing about operational level of war. So we call it a division level. So sometimes it translates to levels. I agree with what you're saying, translating tactics, and there's a Sun Tzu quote about, tactics without strategy is just the noise before defeat. But I also put it into any plan has to be reasonable, feasible, suitable, everything. So even I agree with you in the IDF tactical fighting, excellent. I mean, if you even look at the number of every one of them being felt, and I know Amanda has children or IDF soldiers in her family, amazing. But when a military takes something off the table for developing what we call best military advice to the political leaders that should be setting the strategic goal, and in Gaza, there's nuances that I think people are like, well, you should have had this day one plan here at the beginning. And having now been, talked to everybody from the prime minister to Dermer to everybody, is there was no feasible straight solution presented to anybody. There is a problem with the IDF's concept of operations, that it is this raiding force. It's not meant to hold ground. And I think in one of your truths later, you talk about Operation Gideon's Wall is not a big change. In order to have done this, and some people try to quickly run to what's called the clear, hold, build strategy, right? Which is both a operational framework and also a counterinsurgency strategy that we developed 6 years into Iraq after forgetting about it for a long time. So 6 years into doing it one way, we decided to go to this clear, hold, and build. And of course, Israel doesn't have 6 years. But the IDF is a raiding force. So what is the maximum time, Lazar, that you've spent in Gaza? Most of the brigades rotating every 2 to 3 months, while divisions stay there. They rotate into Gaza out of those, right?
Yeah, so for me, it was at the beginning, late November till mid-February, and that was the height of it. And since then, it's been 6-week deployments.
Yeah. So I know, and you kind of mentioned it in the podcast and in the article, is that for the first most part of this, based on resource constraints as well as doctrine, the IDF weren't even clearing areas that they were in, like Khan Yunis. They were raiding specific objectives to Jabalia, to Gaza City. They weren't clearing any much until right before the last ceasefire, where they're back in places and they're actually clearing every house, every structure. But that's still for 2 months. So they're doing this war 2 to 3 months at a time and then rotating out. In order to really present something different, you have to let go of the we will not occupy, because clear, hold, and build is absolutely occupying the ground. And the ratios of what force power you would need to do that, if you even had a certain percentage of the population that was neutral to you, it's over 100,000 soldiers. So could the IDF have started on October, whatever, 10th, and said, okay, we're going to mobilize 300,000 troops and keep them mobilized for the entire time that it takes to achieve the goal, which is this is all about power. So some people, and I don't know if you mentioned it, destroying Hamas's military capability is measurable. It's what militaries can do. They can see it. Removing something from power, as you recognize that you have to put something else in power, there's a question of, well, who that power would be. And every conversation I've ever had with an Israeli official, like, nobody knows who that other power will be. But the IDF said, and Israel says, well, it won't be the IDF. We will not occupy Gaza. So, okay, there's no day one if that's the assumption going into it, let alone the concept of how do you hold the ground, clear the ground. And you talked about like repopulating, giving people a vision. The challenges of Gaza are so great that I understand why you couldn't articulate a day one, because there's no solution that even Israel can agree to that would lead towards the removal of Hamas as the power. You've gotten there very innovatively on dismantling the military piece by piece by raiding in and out, lowering their power, and now through the humanitarian element. There's still no answer to, well, who will be the next power, as there's been so many different courses of action, even imagine, but there is no history to this to say, given this case, if you don't occupy, right? So if you don't show willingness to hold the ground, and historically, even going back to October 7th, you start a war, the borders do change, and the ability to govern a population do historically change. So there's some abnormal history as well going on with what strategy has been shown to work in any similar case.
So let me ask you this then. So if we're establishing that there is limits on how much you can keep the reserves called up, or different reserve units, and you have to limit that. And there is also a desire to not let this war go on for years. And you have to replace Hamas with something. Then perhaps or the government's insistence that it cannot be the Palestinian Authority, and we know how corrupt they are and, all their problems. Perhaps that is, for political reasons, something that is keeping this war from moving much quicker to a clear victory.
So I wrote an article, it was early on in Foreign Affairs, about Israel's winning, as in they're achieving measurably all three goals, but doesn't mean they're going to win. And I think we're at that point where the Israeli society is saying, look, and I think you mentioned it on the last one, like, we want this to end. That's because democracy, societies decide. You can win every battle, but once your society says, I'm no longer willing to sacrifice the blood and treasure to achieve the goal. If anybody thought this wasn't going to take years, then they are misapplying military history. As in order to take Hamas, who's been there for 17 years, radicalizing the population from birth, with the Palestinian Sesame Street to the school books, UNRWA, everything. You can't start de-radicalization. You can't start reconciliation of like the clans and all this. You can't do any of that if you're not willing to be the power for a certain amount of time. That was taken off the table. And then the idea that a short war, like the history of war isn't that you can do these things quickly to remove a power. Eisenhower said it would take 50 years to de-radicalize the Nazi, basically the population. It didn't take 50 years because there was a middle class, there was institutions. I think there was unreasonable expectations on Israel, and I think the political environment knew that there was no solution on the table that anybody could imagine, but they were progressing towards achieving measurable goals. But now you're at a point where the society is saying, look, then you had the Trump plan, and you mentioned that in your podcast as, while it was now, I think it is agreed, it's not being talked about as much. That was more typical in war. And in your article, you actually mentioned that, with Egypt not letting civilians out, and how the international community wasn't trying to encourage Egypt. In the cases you give, like Ukraine and Syria, nobody, of course, there was an encouragement for countries to take refugees in, but there wasn't a country like Egypt stopping refugees from getting out of the war zone. In Ukraine, 3 to 5 million. There were some countries that said, not us, but there was not one gatekeeper, which limits Israel's ability to do anything, if even within what's normal of moving the civilians to be able to lessen the power of Hamas. I don't have any solutions to you, but I'm just trying to add the context to, it would be impossible to say if we go back in time, although you want to put in all the context of all the resource constraints, the international condemnation constraints, all of these constraints that were put on Israel, even the having to fight Hezbollah at the same time, having to fight Iran at the same time, with the fact that the population wasn't allowed to get out of the way. And that another reason why you focus on the north is because the clearest path to get civilians out of the way was going from north to south. All of these factors, but the number one thing is that there's nothing that any strategist could have said, like, here's what the plan is to achieve the goal of replacing Hamas as the power in Gaza. You're right, Israel itself says the Palestinian Authority, which I agree to. If a terrorist organization is not willing to recognize Israel as a state, they probably shouldn't be put in charge of a population.
With Operation Rising Lion in full force, the moment to act is now. Your investment sends a clear message. Israel is not alone. Go to israelbonds.com or scan the on-screen QR code to invest in Israel bonds now.
So I think we could talk about we've talked about the Gideon's Chariots operation.
Yes.
I'll just give, my quick 2 cents, and then I'd like to hear yours. This was presented as finally Israel is set up to defeat, hachra'ah, as we say in Hebrew, decisively defeat Hamas on the battlefield. We finally have the more aggressive, ostensibly, chief of staff. We have the defense minister who's more in tune with what Netanyahu wants. They put all of the active duty tanks, infantry, engineers, and they had this plan to eat up and hold on to land in the Gaza Strip. If Hamas agrees to a deal, great, it will be on Israel's terms, and if not, then they're going to be defeated. And then you add into that this new humanitarian effort. From what I've seen now, and we're months into the campaign, it kind of looks like more of the same, in that, does Hamas really think it's about to be defeated? No, it has less ground. It's pushed back a little bit. We have more land, but is that translating? No, we're still moving slowly, and we're still waiting and we're still saying this pressure finally will force Hamas to accept the deal. And on the humanitarian front, if indeed this GHF campaign is really a key to breaking Hamas's civil control, then probably Israel should find a way to do it that doesn't involve, however many are being killed, but does not involve live fire around the civilians who are waiting for it. That's the best way to undermine it. It's the best way for civilians not to go along with it. And just one final point, we have these reports about the Abu Shabab clan in eastern Rafah. And it looks like they're giving, this clan that's kind of unsavory, but they're not Hamas. Maybe that if we're doing that quietly, maybe that is a model that could be used elsewhere and should be ramped up. But it seems like after all this talk, there's a lack of focus on what exactly this campaign needs to do to decisively defeat Hamas. And maybe at some point we have to say, we've tried talking, we've tried pressuring Hamas. They're just not going to make a deal, and we have to make peace with that.
Yeah, there's a lot there, although I 100% agree with you, and it gets into the disciplined truth that I 100% agree with the Facebook, and now with the humanitarian zones, and I have a paper I'm writing about this because I experienced it myself in Iraq. The warning shots, where basically firing live fire rounds to keep people out of your security bubble. Although that's the huge threat to the IDF, as the IDF lost all those soldiers very recently. Somebody in civilians walking up and throwing a bomb into their vehicle or attaching it to the side of their vehicle. But the warning shots is something that you do when you don't have another tool there to keep people out of your security bubble, because you never want to remove that right of self-defense to soldiers. On Operation Gideon's Chariot, though, the one thing as an outsider that I saw, of course, is that everything was different. The Hamas military at the point that Gideon's Chariot had restarted was completely different. It didn't have organized formations. It, of course, has this guerrilla force. It has recruitment of teenagers. But the fact that the IDF said they're willing to hold ground and then clear it more deliberately, like they were right before the ceasefire, I think that's different. I agree it didn't solve the solution of the unknowns of, okay, are we going to let Gazans out of Gaza through Egypt? Are we creating new humanitarian zones so we can actually go into areas? So there's like 30% of Gaza that the IDF's not been to once. And I think you mentioned it on the podcast just a couple of days ago about places like Deir Blah and other places that the IDF haven't been once because of the concerns of the hostages. But as an outsider, I did view Gideon's Chariot as drastically different, and the acknowledgement to stop just raiding in and out of Gaza, which was effective at dismantling Hamas's military. But if you want to get to that step of removing their power to govern the population, well, you can't do that if you're not there. Although the fact that the IDF are still rotating every 2 to 3 months, I'm not going to say it's bad as the U.S. military fighting a 20-year war 1 year at a time. They're just fighting 1 year over and over again. If you're not going to hold the ground and keep it, then it's going to be real hard to do that last step of creating something else there. Because this is the idea that you can create one sovereign power over the Gaza Strip rather than cut it up and, like has been done, and create smaller of all the clans controlling different areas. So many unknowns there. I do think that it is different, but I agree with you that there is no articulation of what is the end result here. And one of the reasons is they know what it's not, as in it's not going to be Hamas, not going to be the Palestinian Authority. And the clan thing, I wrote about that. That's very normal. We did it. World War II, everybody did it. If the number one goal that has to be achieved first is destroy Hamas's military and political power, then all of these things still are getting you closer. I agree with your criticism that it's not an articulation of what the end state looks like, because I don't think anybody can answer that personally.
Can I jump in here? I've been listening to you guys, and it's so fascinating because on the one hand, it appears, John, that you are defending our IDF, and Lazar is on the other side criticizing it so deeply because we all care so much about it. And as you mentioned, we are all involved with the IDF. And that's my question for you, actually, John. The culture of the army here in Israel is so drastically different than it is in other countries such as the United States, which has a professional army. And you keep talking about how the army cycles in and out. And just, speaking as the mother of 3 combat soldiers, when they're not home for a month, they're whining so deeply they miss their mom's cooking, shall we say. And the U.S. Army, for example, when my brother served in Korea, he was gone for a year. So it's just a very different patience level, a very different timeline to begin with. And can you speak to this idea that our army, the IDF, is an army of citizens, as is the U.S., but it's an army of people who are really fighting for their own country, whereas, of course, the U.S. has fought wars offshore, off the continent for, decades.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't think that can be understated. Not just the fact that it's the whole of society fighting, and it's every family has a soldier, where the United States military, even during the global war on terrorism, it's less than 1% of the population was serving, complex ideals about believing in the interest. Every IDF soldier I've met knows what they're fighting for. But the fact that they can see their homes behind them, so if a Hamas rocket gets off, although there's been very rarely, it's going to your house behind you. Your mom may be, sitting off of Erez waiting on you. There's so many elements here that are very unique to Israel, and that does change the psychology of the warfare. Although many elements of the kind of what we call the band of brothers and sisters and that camaraderie and the shared understanding of what they're fighting for is there. But you're right, as a society, militaries don't go to war, societies go to war. And most people who haven't been to Israel, they don't know just the terrain of this. You can see everything. This isn't a far off threat. There is that element, though, of how long do you put people in towards the goal. And this is a society who needs those soldiers, many of them business owners, and the cost of the GDP, people really rarely talk about the economic cost that Israel is doing to fight this war. In some of these bigger wars, which weren't existential for some of the fighters, but existential for others, like World War I, World War II, you went to war until the war ended. There was no, although I jumped into Iraq, again, the debate on the objectives, not knowing what the timeline would be, not knowing if we were coming back when, 12 months, 15 months. But you look back at those other wars, they were going until the war was won, basically. So I don't know what the right looks like. I definitely understand that context, and I wish other people understood it more. My criticism, although it's really a comment about, if you were going to get to this, hold this ground, although like I said, with the 55th guy he knew every street in Bet Hanun because he had been there for many times in many of these operations against Hamas, which had a different goal, which is hard for people to understand. This is an unlimited goal. You can't compare it to what was achieved against Hezbollah, Iran, nothing. The goal to remove a power historically takes a lot of time and a lot of resources.
And I think just my final question, based on what you just mentioned, Hezbollah and Iran, when you look at the campaigns against both of those enemies, and I think they were absolutely featured a lot of stunning elements, beyond what I imagined. Does that change the way you look at the Gaza campaign? Should that color the way we understand what's going on in Gaza, or do you think they're just such separate circumstances and enemies that they're really two different or three different campaigns that have to be looked at independently?
Absolutely looked at independently. There are a lot of, of course, comments that can be made. Israel did disengage, did have a containment strategy towards Hamas, didn't have much human intelligence involved in there, wasn't planning the level with Hezbollah, and now we've seen with Iran. You can point to that, but just the context is so different. Like, why are there the civilian casualties in Lebanon and the infiltration of Hezbollah? Because it's a completely different society, a diverse society of Christian and various groups. The civilian population, when the war started, was able to evacuate, and they got the notice and they did evacuate. The nuances, I'm the urban warfare guy, so of course the IDF was facing an urban warfare challenge with no parallel in Gaza, but also with the radicalization of the population, the trapped civilians, the international condemnation, the split resources. Every one of these has to be looked at differently. Although I've had very ignorant people say, well, if they can do this to Hezbollah, why couldn't they do that to Hamas? Which is just ignorance on the context of both enemies and the evolution of the threat and even the societies of these two different locations.
Lazar, John, I think we could discuss for another couple of hours, but we're going to let our listeners have a break, at least until our next week, Friday Focus. And John, I so appreciate you reaching out to us and joining us just for this discussion. I have so much more to ask you, so I hope you'll join us again in the near future.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Lazar. Thank you, Amanda.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Amanda. It was great fun.
Such a pleasure. Thanks for listening to the Times of Israel's Friday Focus. Please check out another installment next week. This episode was produced by the Podwaves and video edited by Thomas Gersh. If you have any questions or comments, reach out. podcast@timesofisrael.com. Until next week. Shalom.